Some people say that the way to write a PhD thesis is to just keep typing without reading or editing what you've done until you have a complete draft. And many PhD supervisors will also refuse to give any feedback until the document is complete. But this approach guarantees that your writing won't be very good, that the process will take far longer than it needs to, and that when you try to edit it, it will be a nightmare. And not only does this make your life more difficult, it makes your supervisor's job much harder too. So if you've been following this approach and you're overwhelmed, the problem isn't you. In 15 years of coaching thousands of PhD students, I have never seen this approach of writing without editing or any feedback work well. Not once. Yes, people complete their PhDs eventually, but they succeed despite their approach, not because of it. And the process is far more stressful than it needs to be, and the writing is never as good as it could have been. So if you want to do anything well, or if you want to improve any skill, there has to be constant feedback. Now, I don't necessarily mean formal feedback from somebody else, although this is helpful. I mean, there has to be some kind of signal, some awareness of what you're doing and how it's going, so you can adapt. Some of this feedback and adaptation will happen in the moment while you're doing something. And then afterwards, you might have some kind of review where you look back on what you've done, assess it, and decide what to do differently. And this is a universal principle that applies to everything you do. If you were a chef, you would need to use your senses while you cook, tasting and watching and smelling and maybe even touching and listening to the food, because this gives you feedback which you need to respond to in the moment if the end result is going to be any good. Then, when you taste the final dish, you might decide to change something next time. Of course, if you work in McDonald's or if you only cook microwave meals, then you don't need to do this because the process has already been worked out for you. But if you actually want to cook well and develop the skill or innovate in any way, there is no way to do it without feedback. Now, when you get very skilled at something, a lot of this process of feedback and adaptation can happen subconsciously. So it can feel like you're doing it without thinking because you've done it so many times before. But there is actually a lot going on in the brain. But even when you reach that high level of ingrained skill, there will be times when the subconscious processes established through practice aren't enough, and you have to stop and think and figure out what to do. So continuing with the chef analogy, if you want to innovate or develop a new skill, maybe trying a new technique or ingredients you've never used before, you won't be able to do it without conscious thought, without trial and error, and some kind of feedback. So coming back to academic writing, if you follow that approach of writing an entire draft without reading or editing your work, it's the same as trying to cook in the dark without tasting your food, which inevitably causes quite a few problems. First of all, it's impossible to know if you're on the right track. You might also forget what you've already said, and then it's impossible to know when you're done. Most of the students I speak to who write this way end up just going in circles, either saying the same thing over and over without developing an argument, or constantly adding more literature or more new ideas because they think they need to get everything down before making any editorial decisions. Then, if eventually somehow they manage to submit something, it will most likely be torn apart by their supervisor because, of course, it won't be good if you haven't even read what you've written. Then, somehow, you've got to motivate yourself to start the whole cycle again after having your work and your confidence ripped to shreds. And it will be more difficult second time around because you won't have developed the skill of editing, but then you have to try to do it on a huge scale, perhaps under time pressure, with so much feedback that it's overwhelming and you don't even know where to start. And unfortunately, this situation is so common that people think this is just how writing is. It's something you simply have to suffer through. Now, as I said, many people are able to struggle their way through and succeed, but I've also seen this approach of just writing without editing ruin people's lives, with the stress leading to serious and lasting mental and physical health problems, as well as breakdowns in relationships and even financial ruin as they spend years paying crazy tuition fees, which the universities are happy to accept, while at the same time delaying their entry into the job market. So this is an issue that needs to be taken seriously. And if this standard approach of writing without editing causes these problems so often, we have to do things differently. And one of the simplest changes to make is to shorten the feedback cycle of writing and editing. So instead of spending months or years writing tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of words, you can write maybe 2 pages and then read over it and try to edit it. Now, this might still be difficult and you might feel some anxiety about it. But if you struggle to edit 2 pages, how are you supposed to edit 200? The only way is to engage with the problem often and on a small scale. And then if you can't figure out what to do, just writing more or writing about something else isn't a solution. It's far better to show those 2 pages to someone who knows what they're doing and get feedback. And if you get feedback on a small amount of writing, it's going to be far quicker, far easier, and far more effective for both of you than sending a complete draft. So when I work with students, I can tell within 1 page or less what they need to work on in terms of fundamental skills. And because people tend to be consistent in the things they do well or badly, if we identify and work on specific issues on a small scale, you can then apply those skills to the rest of the document. Also, one of the key principles in writing is that everything you put on the page sits within the context of what you said earlier. So to give just one example, if you say the aim of this thesis is whatever it is, then everything else is understood and assessed by the reader in the context of that stated aim. So you might have a perfectly well-written paragraph, but if it doesn't make sense in the context of the stated aims of the document, then it's just going to confuse the reader. This means that if there's a problem with the aims, if you haven't decided what they are, or if they're confusing or contradictory, this will affect everything else that follows. Another key principle is that writing requires you to make decisions. Now, this can be scary, but if you avoid making decisions by just writing whatever comes to mind with the thought that you'll come back and decide later, then you might feel better in the short term, but long term, it means that your writing gets more and more complicated and difficult to edit, but without actually developing anything useful. So in writing, as in life, making one clear decision makes subsequent decisions easier. Or you could even say that it makes subsequent decisions possible. And avoiding decisions for fear of making a mistake might seem to keep your options open, but actually all it does is keep you in a perpetual state of self-doubt. Making key editorial decisions in writing often means deciding not to do certain things, which in turn allows you to focus and properly develop an idea. This is impossible to do if you're just dumping everything on the page. So sometimes it's necessary to identify and fix problems or to make important editorial decisions before going any further. To keep going until you have a full draft before thinking about it just makes no sense. So feedback is an essential part of the writing process, whether that's feedback you give yourself by reading what you've written or feedback from others. And the more often you go through this cycle on a small scale, the better. Apart from anything else, it gives you something to do when you're stuck or when you haven't worked on it for a while. So if in doubt, just read over what you have, remind yourself of what you've already said, and maybe correct any little mistakes you notice. Do that often, and by the time you finish, you will have read over every page multiple times, and the first complete draft will be a lot better. But there are two problems I would like to acknowledge here. The first is the issue of perfectionism. And of course, if you keep going over the same work and changing things and never being happy with what you've done, this isn't a good thing. But the problem here isn't that you're reading and editing and taking care of your work. If you want to do anything well, you have to take care of it. The problem is that you can't make a decision, either because of a lack of confidence or a lack of knowledge in how to construct or edit your writing. These issues can temporarily be avoided by writing more or writing about something else, but they can't be solved this way. The other problem is that if you show your work to someone else, not everybody has the skill or knowledge to give useful feedback. This is in part because there are plenty of bad writers in academia, but even the good ones might not be able to explain what they do because so much of it is subconscious. So they will be able to write well themselves, or they will know good writing when they see it, but won't be able to explain it. Now, this isn't a criticism. So when I started coaching PhD students 15 years ago, despite being a good writer, I didn't really know how to teach it. But by speaking to thousands of students, I was gradually able to identify the common problems and figure out how to guide people through them. So I offer one-to-one coaching and an online writing course that both incorporate this kind of rapid cycle feedback, which I'll link to below, but I can't personally help everyone. So if you are a PhD supervisor and you don't know how to best help your students, or if you're an aspiring writing coach, get in touch by following the link below and I'll see what I can do to help. So just to finish, I know that there are people who disagree with me, some who disagree quite strongly. I even once had a professor of education from my own university tell me that my work was deeply offensive and disrespectful. And I will never convince people who are so ingrained in their way of doing things. But if you disagree with me, let me ask you this. How many people who follow this approach of writing without reading or editing their own work are able to write and finish quickly, write well, and enjoy the process? There might be a few, but I think it's extremely rare. And then let me ask you, how many people do you know of who follow this approach of writing without reading or editing their own work, who suffer and struggle, but never actually finish? So my approach of shortening the writing editing cycle might not work for everyone, even though it's based on universal principles of coaching and skill development, which are well known in every field except for academic writing. But at least with my approach, you can try it or try it multiple times and quickly figure out if it works for you. So there's not much risk in trying it out. And if it doesn't work, then you haven't lost much time. But if it does work, it could save you months or even years of unnecessary pain.